Wow. Well, we're piling them in. I think there's going to be a sort of diaspora on dialing. Right. I'll tell you what, the provision of wine's looking very generous. Yeah, 3 bottles each.
See, we're already getting one in.
See, what am I doing?
This is how the questions
Oh,
come in.
I see. Oh,
And
right,
so, like,
okay.
we got one, is there a difference between meditation and... Oh, wait, this is because it's my church service. My church service is usually...
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a very good...
Why is that about walking? And that'll get you to this event. It's a thing called Slido.
Do they have to connect to Wi-Fi or anything? Or?
Yes, I think there's a church Wi-Fi, which I will have to ask them about because I don't have if there's a
Code,
open or if
password.
Can anybody see if there's a code on the Wi-Fi?
Got it all? Okay. Okay, sure, pleasure, yeah.
SLI.do. That should take you to what's it called, Slido. And Trinity should be the hashtag to get in, or the. Do you guys call it? What do you guys call it here? Hashtag?
Yeah.
Right? Well, we call it a pound sign.
Yeah, which is very confusing. It's a hashtag. It looks like a hash brown. Pound sign is there.
Who was it? Was it Jimmy Fallon and Justin Timberlake that the whole hashtag SNL skits? Well, very American references. Sorry.
It's not your fault.
I introduced myself to the Free Church guys the other day. So I'm like, I'm American for my sins.
Yeah.
And, we'll just get that out of the way. I need to apologize.
Is the camera up there? Is there a camera? Up there.
I should pull up the live stream and see what it looks like. A few minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So,
Are you going to say a bit about what Trinity Forum is?
I'll mention it.
Yeah.
As briefly as possible.
Yeah.
What's the phrase over there? Non-for-profit?
not for profit, yeah. You can make a profit, you just don't distribute it to shareholders. If you say non-profit, that means you make a loss.
Well, I guess we shall get started. Did everybody was everybody able to access Wi-Fi in here, or some form of internet? We will have an opportunity for in-person questions as well, and I'll explain that about that.
It's rather strange setup where we're just looking at an empty space, isn't it? No audience.
Yes, thank you for all sitting near the front. I was slightly worried that you'd all sit right at the back.
Yeah, that's true. Very young audience too.
Maggie? I probably should say hi to James and Lucy as well. But more importantly, Maggie. Really good to see you, Maggie. Started. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to everyone in person. Hello. I was told to talk directly into the mic, so hopefully the volume is all right. Make it taller. Do I look like I'm hunching? There we go. Thank you. My name is Patrick Brown. I'm a postgraduate at New College, which is the School of Divinity, part of the University of Edinburgh. I focus studying hope in the work of Søren Kierkegaard. But in relation to this event, I work for a nonprofit, or not-for-profit, I think I was told to say, called Trinity Forum Europe, which is interested in making sure leaders think deeply on important questions with space for a Christian perspective. So they're involved in a lot of leadership development. In relation to the university, they provide space for a community, studying together, and they do work in Oxford, Cambridge, St. Andrews, Edinburgh, as well as they have some work with civil servants in Whitehall. If you would like more information on that, you can go to trinityforumeurope.com. We run a few events each academic term, or at least attempt to. Certainly COVID has put the kibosh on some of that, and it's I'm very thankful to Old St. Paul's in helping to navigate even the current strike at the university and opening up space for us to have this conversation while not having people have a crisis of conscience for participating in the process. This event, Autism Theology and Life in the Church, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Joanna Leidenhag, who's a lecturer in theology and liberal arts at the University of Leeds, and I'll have her share more about herself later, as well as Stewart Rapley, who is the author of Autistic Thinking in the Life of the Church, and I'll have you share more about yourself later as well. As a point of housekeeping, if the bathrooms, if you back through the archway on the left, if you go back there, they should be on the left, and there should be some more accessible ones as well. In case of a fire, preferred route is to go back down the stairs, out the way you go, and just across the street is the gathering point. There is also a way out toward Carruber's Close, which, Jamie, you're going to have to point in the direction of that for me. Back through there, yes. And certainly, if there are any sort of sensory issues during this event, we do have space over here if you would like just to kind of get away from it all, or you can kind of go back through one of these doors if you need some space for that. We have, as far as Trinity Forum goes, we have another upcoming event on the 10th of March. Due to COVID, I also realized that the venue I had in place had fallen through, so it's to be confirmed, the next venue. But we're doing an event on the 10th of March, which I believe is a Thursday, in the evening on why beauty matters. There's an artist by the name of Alistair Gordon, who's a tutor at the Leeds School of Art, and also an artist who has a studio down in London. So he'll be coming up to speak on concepts of beauty throughout the ages and why he believes beauty is connected to truth and goodness. If you're interested in that, please do keep in touch. I'll be sending out some emails shortly to confirm the location with that. So without further ado, for this event, there's an opportunity to submit questions throughout the event. If you're on the live stream, there should be, I believe, in the comments. Step back a bit from the mic. Is that a little better?
Yes.
There we go. So for that, you should be able to link. If you are in person, you can also go to Slido, which is sli.do, and the event code is Trinity, Trinity. I feel like I was in a spelling bee just then. Very nervous about spelling Trinity wrong. I might lose all credentials I have if I did. No, just kidding. But yeah, so you can submit through that. I'll be watching it throughout the event, so I may interject those questions there. We will also have some time at the end for in-person live questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pose my first question to the speakers. What brought you, share a bit about your story, what brought you to being interested in this topic? What's the direction of your research? And what are you working on now? So I'll just leave it very open-ended, and we'll start the conversation there.
Would you like me to go first? Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much to Patrick for the invitation. So my name's Joanna, and I grew up in a family with lots of autistic members of my family. So that was just the context of life for me. I didn't think much of it most of the time. I mean, sometimes it made life a little tricky, depending on the situation that we were in as a family, but it was all that I knew. And I went to university and ended up studying theology as one of my subjects. And I remember very clearly in my final semester at the University of St. Andrews, where I did my undergraduate, and I did a course on theological anthropology, which is the Christian doctrine of humanity, in fancy words. And I remember very clearly learning about what's called relational theologies. These get translated quite widely into churches as what it means to be human is to be in relationship with God. And that this has been a really important aspect of the Christian teaching for a long time. And I remember I asked a question of my lecturer, how do you think that applies to people with autism, like my friends and family members? And I remember very clearly he just said, I don't think anyone's ever written on that. I don't know. Why don't you try? Right. But as an undergraduate, I didn't quite feel prepared. And I just filed the question away in the back of my head and continued to pursue postgraduate research at Princeton Theological Seminary and PhD research at the University of Edinburgh at New College. And now as an early career lecturer, I finally feel ready to grapple with that question. I feel that I've now been given the tools to bring that question to the fore of my research. So I've written a couple of articles, which is why Patrick invited me here today, and I'm working towards writing a book, in a sense, trying to answer that question and to think about what we can learn in theology, in doctrine in particular, because that is my training and my interest, from paying attention to the way that autistic people are different and approach the world differently and experience their world and their faith differently. I think it's something we can learn a lot from and can be a great gift if neurotypical people can listen well to that. So that's what my research is aiming towards and how I got to it.
Okay, but you're not on the spectrum.
But I'm not, no, I don't have an autistic diagnosis, and that is important for me to say myself, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. I'm Stuart Rapley. I'm retired, so when I was asked, what's my occupation, I'm retired. I do a number of things in my spare time. I'm a trustee at the National Autistic Society. I have recently done an MA, which gave me the opportunity to go through some of the questions that I've had over the years, because I am on the spectrum, and that's what then led to the book. Out of the book has also come an opportunity to set up a community to support autistic Christians, something under a sort of broad banner of Church for Everyone. And so I'm working with a church in Manchester on a national platform to do that. So that takes a fair amount of my time as well. I'm just about to go to Aberdeen, God willing and weather willing, to talk about the possibility of doing a PhD. So there you go, never give up. So the story as to how did I get here, there are two parallel paths. One is the Christian journey and then the autistic journey. So Christian journey, I had no Christian background until going to university, although I did grow up in the eons where we had an assembly every day that was an act of Christian worship. So broadly familiar with Christianity, was converted at university and got involved with something called the Navigators. Some of you may have heard of them. That really worked for me. It was a nice compact group. It was very intense. It was very structured. If you know anything about them, they came out of the US military at the end of the Second World War. And that worked. So I left university, got a job, stayed around the Navigators, got asked to join their staff, and went to Birmingham University and led a student ministry there for 8 years. And once I then moved on from that, got married, we had children arriving there, so moved away from the Navigators. There was a whole period of my life where my faith started to come unstuck. And I went through quite a major depression for about 6 years, including suicidal thoughts. You never know how close you are to the edge till you've got over it, so I have no idea how bad that was, but it felt pretty bad. But essentially my faith deconstructed. So many questions with no answers. So moved up to Manchester, 2 kids, went along to church, and my experience of church was, okay, well, I'm in the service, fairly structured, no idea what to do with coffee after church, so I just stand around until my wife's finishing chatting to people, and then we can go home. So what then started to happen was things in the service started to go wrong. I didn't agree with the sermon. I don't agree with this hymn. And I was very busy in my professional life, so I used to run fairly major change programs, so separation of the post office and Royal Mail, that kind of thing. So it's pretty intense and stressful. And to spend my Sunday being confused, perplexed and upset in church didn't seem to me to be a very good use of my time. So I slowly but surely backed away from that. So I've done all kinds of things in a church context, led home groups, cluster groups, ministry at work, initiatives, all kinds of things. But I gradually sort of backed away to the point where I was no longer going to church. Then there's a parallel story coming in here. So the autism story, I got diagnosed at the age of 52. And I'd always been peculiar. So I was fine, same story, at school, in class, behind the desk, no problem. Playground, I got no idea what's going on. So I just stand there like an idiot and be ignored. So a number of things brought things to a head, both in my professional life. I was great while I was in a technical speciality. As soon as I got senior enough to hit the politics, it all started to keep going wrong. I was in consultancy, so there's always an end to a consultancy assignment. You can always get another one. But in here, something was not working out. And so my youngest son, cut a long story short, got diagnosed when he was about 12. And in the process, I started asking a lot of questions, saw a couple of programs on TV, and said to the psychologist who diagnosed him, who can I talk to? So I went and talked to somebody, got a diagnosis, and from that point, the two stories go together, because that started not only to make sense of my life generally, but of my faith and the questions. And so I started to kind of put the questions together with the autism thing. Eventually my wife got fed up and said to me, why don't you retire and stop banging your head against the wall and go and do something you enjoy, go and do some studying, go on, get out of my way. And so I went and did an MA, and some of it's just general stuff, but I got an opportunity in a dissertation to explore the questions that have been bugging me. And what I found was a lot of thinking and writing had been done about church as a social event, so in the context of autism. So being greeted at the door very cheerily, being asked to stand up and turn around and speak to people you don't know, sharing the peace, coffee after church, come to our meeting, come to our meeting, come to our meeting, meetings everywhere. So there's a lot written about how to handle that, but I'd worked that out myself mostly, coping strategies. Quite a lot written increasingly by autistic people themselves, writing about their experiences from a church, from a sensory perspective. Sometimes the building and the noise and all the rest of it, but sometimes they're deep spiritual experiences that were really intense. I was just full of questions about my faith, about surely we can't think that God's like this and so on and so forth. I didn't find anybody thinking about the Christian faith from an autistic point of view, church as a cognitive experience, except to say, here's some stuff for children, and here's how to help them kind of get the message. But it seemed to me that was more about helping them to overcome their learning difficulties. What about people that don't have learning difficulties and have questions about the message, saying, well, hang on a minute, you sure that's the message? So I wrote a dissertation. I interviewed 9 autistic Christians around the country, specifically people who were positive about their churches. So very easy to find autistic Christians who've fallen out with church and all the rest of it. So these were positive people who had figured out ways of hanging in there with their church. And I talked to them about their concept of God, because it seemed just increasingly difficult for me to hold on to what was conveyed as the typical theistic view of God. So the supernatural being, a bit like us, only more so, who occasionally sort of fiddled about with bits of the universe and found me a parking space and let the rest of mankind starve to death. I'll be very interested to see what Joanna says about this relational stuff. So, because I moved really down the track of saying, for me, God is not an anthropomorphic God. The notion of God as being a person that I am having a relationship with doesn't make any sense at all. Then you come to prayer. Well, if that's what you think of God, then the idea of prayer as talking to God, chatting to God, doesn't really make much sense. But possibly the idea of being in God and being with God and living my life in God. So Paul says, you know, the God in whom we live and move and have our being at the end of Acts. So, and then what about the scriptures? Well, autistic people, and maybe we'll get into this later, tend to think instinctively. It's not that they can't necessarily learn differently, tend to think quite black and white, quite literal. There's a lot in the scriptures which, if you take it literally, as I did, you know, Jesus says, give to everybody that asks of you, so I tried that. In 1974, I was in a phone box asking a bank manager for more money, which in 1974 wasn't so easy. So I was bankrupt, and the guy that I tried to help was in prison, so that didn't work out too well. But all of my neurotypical friends, when I kind of tell them this story, they always say, well, of course not. That doesn't mean that. Of course, it's obviously this. So, well, it wasn't that obvious to me. So, learning to handle the Bible, which is full of metaphor and indirect language, very difficult. Is it true? What about Jesus? So we've got two genealogies of Jesus. They don't fit together. And what's more, one of them goes from Jesus all the way back to Adam. Well, either I have both of those as real people, which gives me a problem, or one of them as a real person, the other one imaginary, which is even worse. So, so all kinds of questions that I couldn't get answers to. So interpreting the Bible, and then also, it depends on your tradition, but lots of other texts we get given. So hymns, songs, creeds, liturgy, how to process those, and there are really kind of two aspects to that. Either you enjoy singing, saying the words together, it builds the community through time across the world. We're all saying and singing the same words, and isn't that great, and so on and so forth. Or you're analysing the words, saying that doesn't make any sense, that disagrees with this, and so on. So, which is more where I was coming from. So those were the ideas that I talked to these people about. And their ideas and mine story are written into this book. What I then did was say, well, okay, how can we help the church do something with this? And so about a third of the book then is about how I came up with a framework for how to help the church move forward. And we can talk more about that later, but that's what this pilot exercise is also about. So.
You could try standing up to that.
I think it's working now. There we go. Otherwise, I would have just stood up. Thank you both for that. I love the way the publisher synopsis puts it for your book, and it says autism was only identified and recognized relatively recently. But even so, one might have expected the church to have moved further in its thinking about how autistic thinking can contribute to the life of the church. And hopefully this event will be another step. We're going to answer all the questions today, right?
Yep.
Certainly we don't expect this event to be, in this conversation with you, I got this feeling as well, this isn't a one-size-fits-all, but we're going to be we're going to turn to Joanna, kind of dig into maybe some of the theological angle of this first, questions of the Imago Dei, what does it mean to be a person, and then kind of steer it back to lived church issues, and through the process try to hold them both together. Mm-hmm. You speak in an article which you call The Challenge of Autism, right? In our conversation, I began thinking of this movement from approaching something like autism as a problem to be solved, right? And then in the end of our language, you talked about as a gift to be explored or realized, right? And so my hope is tonight we'll be moving through that process as well. So let's start with that kind of problematizing, and where this comes out in this sort of turn of the century, turn towards a focus on personhood, relationality, the I-thou relationship from Martin Buber. So I'll read a quote from Harris that you do in your article, a wonderful article called The Challenge of Autism for Relational Approaches to Theological Anthropologies. I believe I got that right. A great article I do encourage you to read. And I think it uncovers a lot of implicit, so these assumptions being made. I mean, relationality is a wonderful thing, right? But when you can value something too much that it's excluding people who we would believe are made in the image of God, who are the image of God. So let me unpack this with the quote from Harris. You write in your article, Harriet A. Harris, who is also the chaplain at this university, in an important article critiqued the then most recent wave of monographs defending the thesis that personhood is relational. Harris argued that whilst relationality is beneficial to the flourishing of personal identity, the idea that relations constitute personhood is not only metaphysically dubious, but, and you begin to quote her, persons are ontologically prior to relations, unquote, but ethically ambiguous, or no, I think this is actually within her quote still, my apologies, but ethically ambiguous since personhood becomes a matter of degree dependent on the quality of the relationship formed. Would you like to unpack what you were seeing there as the problem, so maybe a bit of inspiration for this article, and then how do we go from there as we reflect? Should we use terms of centering autism in theology, or just kind of take it from there and
Sure, yeah, so Harriet Harris's article, is a really good article that's concerned, actually, when she wrote it from the perspective of feminist theology, that was what she was approaching this topic from, of a recent move which some people have called, and which I call the relational turn in theology. So Christian theology has, I think, always highly valued relationships, right? We always have, we have a Trinity, however that's understood. We have Jesus giving us a message of love, and even across vast differences and disagreements in the Christian faith, relationship of some kind is going to be really important. Father-son relationships, friend relationships, talking about the church as the bride of Christ is invoking relationships. So I don't think there's any getting away from the centrality of relationships in the Christian faith. And I don't think we should want to. But I think there can be some problems that are unnecessarily introduced depending on how we define those relationships. So for Harriet Harris, in that article, she was worried that overemphasizing relationships to the extent that a person is valued only insofar as they have good relationships, or is defined by their relationships in a way that becomes problematic, because if that person is in an abusive relationship, then it's not just the relationship that's bad, but that person is being dehumanized. And of course, there's a sense to which that's true, but we want to say that a victim is always still a full human person deserving of dignity, even when they're not given that dignity, right? So that's what she was worried about in that article. But I think there's a really important broader lesson about how we need to be careful in not making how we view people dependent upon the certain performance or certain contingent conditions of their lives, such as a healthy marriage or good friendships, or in this case, a particular neurology that performs in a way that society accepts and approves of, right? So, so we can say all of that while still saying that relationships are important. But being a human and being loved by God is not dependent upon whether or not I'm good at relationships. I could be really bad at them. I could be bad at them, whatever that means, in all sorts of ways and for all sorts of reasons. But I'm still going to be a human person loved by God and made in the image of God. So picking up from that article, that's probably the way I would go. Do you want me to say a bit more about what else I said there, or maybe Stuart wants to come in at this point?
Yeah, sure. I get the emphasis on relationality and the whole idea of being made in the image of God. It seems to me to be one of those phrases, made in the image of God, that we pick up and it then sort of assumes proportions beyond its origin. And I have some real difficulties with it. Because if you're not careful, it presupposes that there's some sort of ideal, and we could go down the route that sort of says, yes, that's what Jesus Christ is about, understood. But it plays into a narrative for autistic people then that says there is an ideal notion of what it means to be a person, to be a human being. There are even definitions of personhood that basically relate that to your kind of rational capabilities and so on and so forth. And I have actually read in a book that there are human beings who don't qualify to be persons because they don't have the requisite rational capabilities. The author tried to dig himself out by then saying, don't worry about it, you have things like dogs and you really value your dogs, but you don't treat them badly and so on and so forth. But they're not persons. But this whole Imago Dei thing, as soon as you set up a paradigm that says there's an ideal model of a human being, then you've got the potential for the autistic person to not fit that model. And then what is the question? Does that person not qualify to be a person? Does that person need to be fixed? And in the same period of time, from the middle of the 20th century, you've got the medical fraternity coming at us saying we have the right to define autism, and it's in these books. So the International Classification of Diseases, so that's a good start. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and then presents autism as a set of deficits. So immediately you've got autism characterized as being, there's an ideal model of humanity, whether it's the medical model or the religious model. Autism is a deficit, is a disease, a mental disorder, and therefore in both models, the answer is it. And I think both of those are questionable assumptions. And for me, I think what I would say, just veering into the scientific space for a moment, what those diagnostic criteria do is articulate a number of some behavioural traits of some people who are on the autistic spectrum. There are other behavioural traits, being intensely loyal, being very honest, and so on and so forth. Why just pick out the ones that we're not so good at? So I do have problems with the Imago Dei thing. I don't know whether you think I'm just a heretic.
Yeah. Could we pick up that point just for a little bit? We could have a whole seminar on the Imago Dei and the concept on that. I mean, some theologians approach it more as a role we are given, right? So more kind of, I guess you might call, I don't know if functional is the right word, but we are meant to be the Imago Dei, or to be the image bearers of God. I think one theologian speaks of us as living statues of God all over the place, right? So, I mean, maybe you could speak to your preference for that, or how helpful is it? What pitfalls should we look out for? And is this something that's just so tied into our theological tradition that it's unavoidable? Maybe to set some more context, I went to a lecture some years back by a sociologist who was looking at different approaches for grounding human value. And he had three categories: theological, scientific, and philosophical. Philosophical, primary capacities-based. Scientific would be just, you might look at genetics or some other kind of scientific basis. And then theological was primarily grounded in the Imago Dei, at least within the Christian West. And there was this interesting connection that those who had the theological grounding were more prone towards social action. And so there was this, I feel like there's an inherent value of not wanting to let go of that thing that unites us all, that thing that makes us equal and have value. So is that something we can get rid of, or is it simply being cautious about how we navigate it? You want to comment on those?
I for a few years, I did just want us to stop talking about it. And I've somewhat been persuaded that it's inevitable, that actually it's better to talk about how to do it well than it is just to tell people not to talk about it, because we're never going to stop talking about it, or at least not in our lifetimes. And actually we're never going to stop talking about it because it's in the Bible, right? So in that sense, Christians can't get away from it. Now, it's interesting because it's only in the Bible a little bit, only in a few places, certainly not the massive concept that it is in theology and in the tradition. And even more problematically, really each time it's mentioned in the Bible, which I think is something 5 or 6 times only, maybe a few, is that about right? Do you know that?
About right.
About right,
Go
yeah,
with it.
sorry.
Yep.
It's used in slightly different ways. So sometimes it's used as a reason not to commit murder. Right? Sometimes it's used most famously in the creation stories, probably to differentiate humans from other animals. That one's quite an ambiguous example. And certainly a number of times in the New Testament to refer to Jesus. So we've got all these different uses. So it's really not clear what we should do with it. But for better or worse, in the tradition, in the church, it's taken on a distinct ethical meaning, right? And that's what, like the example of a reason not to commit murder. You shall not commit murder because people are made in the image of God. And that's a pretty good use, right? It doesn't tell us what the image is. It doesn't really tell us on what grounds humans have the image, if there are indeed any grounds at all. It just tells us, because of this thing, treat each other well, don't murder each other. I think that's a pretty good use.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So absolutely endorse what Joanna's said about that. I think let's not talk about it is probably not a very practical approach. One of the most interesting comments that I came across in my studying for the master's degree was a statement by Catherine Tanner, who is an American theologian, who made an observation that theologians, present company accepted, I'm sure, are often quite happy to make statements without having much idea what they mean. And I think, yes, let's talk about the image of God, but let's be careful what carriages we hitch behind the horses. And so there, a woman, Nancy Iceland, wrote a book called The Disabled God. And she took the view that part of the problem was that our vision of God doesn't include disability, okay? So she's disabled herself. So if you now reconceptualize God and think of God as disabled, think of the wounds of Christ after the crucifixion and resurrection. If you conceptualize God as being disabled, then there's room for me. But that just seems to be sort of a logical circle, you know, conceptualize God as like me, then say I'm in the image of God, hey, I'm okay. That doesn't really seem to add anything. So I'd be much more interested in, okay, so yes, in the scriptures we have these statements. There's a lot of other statements in Genesis that we don't hang quite so much on. But I thought Grant McGaskill, do people here heard about Grant McGaskill up in Aberdeen? Wrote a book called Autism and the Church, and in that he discussed this question. He took the view that Jesus Christ was the only one made in the image of God, but we become partakers in the image of God through our relationship with Christ. And that seemed to me a helpful way of doing it, because we can participate in something without having to be it, and that's helpful. So I've got other things to say about the relationality thing, but do you want to move on to something?
Yeah, I mean, picking up from a conversation we had earlier today, particularly related to, I think the context of the conversation was on whether or not you had to understand something to follow it or to feel comfortable following it. So what would you say is the relationship between what we might call apophatic theology, like leaving room for mystery as it surrounds the image of God, right? Maybe we see from Scripture it being used in certain ways of being in the image of God, or whatever it means to participate in the image of God means this. And perhaps we never have to define what the image of God is. Could you do that, or would you, as an individual, if I could ask, would you struggle with that?
Absolutely. So, would I struggle with the concept? No, and in fact, that's the direction that I have tended to move in. And if you read the book, it's interesting because some of the participants in my research were in that space as well. Some of them had been around the church for most of their life and had kind of got used to the language. So we talk language as though God is a person. We talk about God having a plan, God loving me, God not being very pleased about this, or, and so on and so forth. And they were comfortable on the basis that that's just language, all right? So you almost got this sort of dual view of talking about God like this, but actually, I don't think God's anything like that. But where, or at least their view, was that where the church pitches its tent is pretty much to one side of centre and talks about God as in the context of being a person, rather more than this sort of apophatic approach, which you can find in the Christian tradition, in some of the more mystical traditions and so on and so forth. And then what they saw was the congregation is that much further away, again this way, and we see ourselves as towards the edge or off the edge, and so there's quite a big gap between us and the rest of the congregation. Now, whether anybody else would agree with that, I don't know. I wasn't in the business of doing control groups on that because I just wanted to know what did they see, what did they think.
As it relates to, I keep shutting this off, I apologize. I'm worried the battery's going to run out on me. So a question came through which relates to what we're speaking of now, so I guess we'll just address it quickly now. So it reads, Christ incarnate is God disabling himself from his fullness into humanness as a sign of solidarity in whatever the human condition might be? Question. So,
so the idea that in becoming incarnate, God, I've not heard before this idea of disabling God's self. The traditional way of articulating that is called Canonic Christology, God emptying God's self of some, and there are different ways to view it, but of some divine properties. So although God, the Father, the Spirit, knows everything, is omniscient, doesn't always appear that Jesus Christ in his life on earth was omniscient, say. Or certainly God, the Father, cannot die and suffer, and yet in Jesus we get God dying and suffering and bleeding. And so one way of articulating that is as a God emptying, God giving up certain divine properties or attributes. In solidarity with humanity, probably, but not. That can't be the whole picture, right? God becomes incarnate in Jesus and knows what it is like to be human, lives a human life, dies a human death. But that's not all that happens, right? It's not just that God comes to identify with humanity as if God needed to learn that, as it were. Of course, the Christian story says there's more going on there, i.e. that we needed God to do that, to die for us, to save us. So certainly I can accept part of the story being a kind of solidarity move. You can tell I'm hedging my way around not entirely endorsing the God disabling God's self language, and that's because I just think the language of disability and disabling is multifaceted and complicated, and I don't think it. I wouldn't want to hitch it to any one particular. I think it needs to stay multifaceted and complicated, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you for that. Now, we've been kind of in the weeds of Imago Dei and this, to kind of as a touch point to bridge between the theological into what we might more readily see as the practical lived church issues. I mentioned earlier a phrase that's very common, at least within American evangelicalism, saying that Christianity is not a religion, but a relationship. there's this focus, and we don't have to get into the complicated nature of that kind of phrase and its pros and cons. But yeah, so let's talk about, we speak of Trinity as relational. We speak of the body of Christ as relational. So how do we move from seeing autism as a problem to, I think I just lost this mic, so for the live stream people, I'm going to come up here. Apologize, I believe I lost the battery there. How do we move from, theologically speaking, into lived church issues, move from seeing autism as a problem to seeing the gift of it, while knowing how to speak about relationality, and which is central to the Christian faith?
Well, I'm actually really pleased that you've already brought up Apophaticism. I think that would be an easy go-to example of a way in which, so Apophaticism is often known to emphasize, it's called negative theology. That's not because it's bad or sad or anything like that. It's because we can make positive and negative kinds of statements. So I can say this is a table, it's a positive statement, and I can say it's not a chair. That's a negative statement, as it were. So I'm saying it's something it's not. I'm sorry if this is patronizing anybody, but I think it's helpful to be on the same page. And apophatic theology is a way of talking about God that emphasizes always that no matter what we say God is, a person, loving, a father, there's always a part of that we actually have to say, but also God is not like human fathers. And God is loving, but not like love I've ever experienced from another human. And God is a person, but not like I'm a person, right? So apophatic theology is an absolutely central, I would say, an absolutely indispensable part of all Christianity. But the church sometimes forgets that because we want to proclaim God in positive terms. And I don't mean nice terms, good terms. I mean, we want to say we know what God is or who God is, and we want to tell people who God is. We want to introduce people to God. Wonderful. But in our excitement to do that, I think we often forget that we don't know who or what God is as well. And I think, reading Stuart's book and hearing other kind of testimonies of autistic friends and Christians who get, but is God really like that? Asking those questions and thinking, helping us slow down, I would say, and remember that no matter all of the things I have to say about God, all my language of God falls short and fails and needs to be accompanied with, but also not, right? So that's an apophatic thing, and that I think is it's a gift to the church, because otherwise we are idolatrous, right? Otherwise, God looks like me, and God looks like how I experience love, or God looks like my favorite leader, or church leader, or political leader, or pop star, or whatever, and these things become idols for us, even when we do not intend them to be. Because we end up thinking, we just lose the mystery, we lose the transcendence. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Just to add to that, at a practical level, I think that the key for me on this is dialogue. Talk to the people in your church, talk to the autistic people. Now, that's easier said than done, I appreciate. But if you remember the three things that I commented on at the beginning, there's church as a social event, church as a sensory event, and church as a cognitive event. Now, there may well be, for some autistic people, not necessarily all, social issues and sensory issues, what we would normally call accessibility. You've got to deal with those first, okay? So, but once people are welcome and comfortable in the church, then the question is not so much how do they just receive what we give, but how can they contribute? And I think what Joanna said is brilliant. So dialogue is the key, and very much at the heart of my book is how to put something on the table that enables that dialogue to take place. And I refer to that as having a match of the day approach. I, for various reasons, have to work out with a trainer 3 times a week, personal trainer, for my sins, which I hate. He is an avid football fan, Manchester United. I know nothing about football, I'm not really interested. But I've discovered that if I watch Match of the Day every now and again, I know enough about football to have a sensible dialogue with him, which is mostly aimed at kind of creating bigger spaces between the exercises, to be honest. But so we don't expect people to be experts in autism. So it seems to me there's a level that you expect the congregation to be at, and that's this sort of match of the day. So they need to know how to have a conversation with an autistic person and what are the sort of things that are likely to happen or worry the person or whatever. There might be another level where people in church leadership, but not just ordained, but anybody trying to get anything done, needs to understand some of the more practical issues. And there might need to be one or two experts around, the go-to person for the tricky questions or whatever. So I think you have to then reckon on a bit of a process in the church of educating and changing the culture and so on and so forth. But talk to people. Let them tell you.
Thank you for that. I think that a point you bring up in a lecture I listened to as well as in your book is these notions of community, of thinking that the church is more than the service, right? And one of the things I love, which I mentioned earlier, is also, I guess part of, maybe it relates to what we were talking earlier of kind of seeing the image of God as this relational concept. We connect spirituality to your degree of relationality. How good are you at relationships? And that's how spiritual you are, right? Which, so for example, one of the examples you used was whether or not someone shows up to a service, right?
Yep.
And if is that the benchmark we want for a good Christian? Would you like to expand upon kind of that point a little bit? And sure. How do we, as we bring people into the church and engage in discipleship, coming alongside each other?
Right.
What was the phrase you used earlier? Disciples for life or something?
Whole life disciples.
Yeah. What does this look like, practically speaking?
Okay, that's a big question.
Oh, that was a big question.
Which bit of it to answer? So the church conceived as a meeting. That's what we do, though, isn't it? Whenever we're going to do anything in the church, we'll set up a meeting. Come to our meeting on Wednesday night. So I talked to the participants in my research about how did they handle the situation? What sort of accommodations did they kind of ask for or make or whatever? Because they were clearly making their commitment to church work. And a number of things came up, fairly straightforward things. One was just being very clear and decisive about what I'm going to go to and what I'm not. And you kind of, well, we all do that, don't we? But one person told me, for example, I'm very unlikely to go to a Christmas service because it's just too many people and so on and so forth. You think, well, that's a bit sad, isn't it? Never to be able to go to church at Christmas. So I think, that was one of them. Reading their own stuff, ignoring what the sermon said and reading their own books anyway. And again, don't we all do that? And we encourage people to read. But these people were typically reading things that possibly disagreed with what they were being taught in church. So there's something that they weren't getting. And we have to think of the church as a community. And I'm trying very hard with the community that I'm setting up, not just to think of it as a group, come to the group meeting on Monday or whatever it is, that it is built around relationships. And they may happen in a service. They may not. And COVID has taught us, has it not, that you can have church without necessarily having services. And so, for the person that's regulating what they go to and what they don't, I'm involved in our church community without going to any of the services at the moment. And our rector thinks that's very funny, thinks it's very appropriate and quite amusing. But it's, you mustn't then turn around and say, because this person doesn't come very often, that they're therefore not committed. And I think it's that equation, the sort of therefore that gets in there, that sort of says, well, therefore they're not really one of us, and so on and so forth. I don't think that answered all of the...
Oh, that's probably far too big of a question I asked you.
Okay.
Is there anything you would like to add to that, Joanna?
I really I just want to build on what you're saying and agree with it, that I think we can always just go for more imaginative ways of engaging with our faith, right? Now, people are pressured for time and resources, and so it's easy to just trot out a blueprint of a service or a style of community that has been. But I think I always, in terms of larger discipleship, and again, I don't think this is about accommodating people who find the traditional way of doing things difficult. I actually think it's about keeping everybody engaged in church in a way that's fruitful, right? So this might mean so for people who struggle with reading, for example, I was part of a conversation about Christianity and dyslexia as well, and so people who struggle with reading, perhaps we could, instead of emphasizing reading your Bible alone, listen to Bible podcasts or go for a walk as you're reading. Now, we do public reading in churches, but this is just a small example to suggest there are different ways of engaging faith. Someone exactly can be committed as part of a prayer circle who doesn't visibly attend on a Sunday, is actually, prayer is the backbone of everything that we do. What an important contribution that is. And I think people go through different seasons of life, different ages, when they have young children, for all sorts of reasons, need to engage with their faith in different ways. And I think we just need to be more perhaps comfortable talking about that and being imaginative about different forms of discipleship that don't always just mean showing up on a Sunday as the... I mean, great for people who do and can and are in the place for showing up on a Sunday, but it's just not the only... Exactly, there's nothing wrong with that. But it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all, perhaps, of what it means to be a disciple. Yeah.
Ooh, thank you for both those comments. I see some more questions coming in, which more on the kind of the theology side, so I don't know if we want to jump back there or kind of keep paving on toward. So I can read them. So ASD, which I believe is autism spectrum disorder, is that correct?
Yeah.
So I have ASD. I see meaning in the metaphors mystery. How can my kind of autism marry up with, I believe that's space, or the space of literalism, or that which occupies the space of literalism? How are both ASD?
Well, I think it's incorrect, and Stuart, you must correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think it's wrong to say that autistic people can't do metaphor or are always totally literal, right? I think language is really complicated. I think we haven't quite got to the bottom of that yet, of what the differences and the similarities are in how language, the instinctual way that autistic people use language, and then how we're all taught to use language as well. I think it's really complicated. What I will say is that the Christian faith uses literal and metaphorical language all the time, interlaid with one another, and again, it's not easy to spot when it's doing what, always. And so I don't think there's any, so it sounds to me like the person who asked this question is saying, how is it that I can use language literally and metaphorically? And I almost want to say, well, don't we all use language literally and metaphorically all the time?
I'll come in on that one.
Please do.
So echo a lot of what Joanna said, so I won't repeat that. But I think in my own experience, I would put it this way. I understand what metaphor is, and simile and all the rest of it. But I don't find metaphor instinctively meaningful. So, the Lord is my shepherd. Okay, what is that supposed to mean? Now, so that does not mean that as somebody who is able to learn, and I think you've then got to distinguish between somebody who is autistic and has learning difficulties, but somebody who is autistic but doesn't have learning difficulties, I can learn. Okay? So in a training course I ran, I set one group, neurotypical people, so we're not talking autistic people here, but just trying to familiarize themselves with some of the issues here. Okay, so if you go in this room, on Zoom, a Zoom room, and discuss what you think it means to say the Lord is my shepherd. And I went in there, and there they were. Well, it doesn't mean, it's obviously this, obviously that, doesn't mean there's a, so okay, so is God going to give me a haircut? one of the things that shepherds do for sheep. So, and they looked at me blankly, and well, obviously not. Why obviously? So clearly, in the metaphor, there were some aspects of a shepherd that applied and some that don't. And how am I supposed to work out which ones those are which? The value of metaphor and simile and so on, so particularly metaphor, is that ultimately we can't define whatever it is we're trying to talk about. And therefore we use a metaphor, because if we could say it, we would say it. And so hence we write poems about love, justice, songs, and so on and so forth. I was really helped in this by a book called What Would Jesus Deconstruct? By a guy called John Caputo, who's an American philosopher. And the title makes you think it's a bit of a sort of trivial book. It is not a trivial book. I would recommend it, but he's a serious philosopher. So at one end you're talking about how do I deal with somebody who gets metaphor, on the other end somebody who's just very literal about everything. Well, instinctively my mind is literal. So in the book I talk about driving up and seeing a sign in front of me with cones going this way, cones going that way, and the sign says use both lanes. Okay? Now, I can't do that. I can use either lane, but it's very difficult to drive a car down both lanes at the same time. Now, that kept me awake for a month. I don't know how long it was. Well, now, did my wife notice it? Yes. Did it keep her awake for a month? No. Okay, so there's the instinctive literalism there, but again, that doesn't mean that one can't learn to be self-aware that that is a problem and bring that into the space of everyday life so that it doesn't just become a disability. Okay, so I'm not sure it's fair to compare just being literalistic on one end and somebody who gets metaphor at the other. So I would say instinctively I'm literal, I don't get metaphor, but I can learn to work my way, and who knows, I might end up being better at it. There's some ways in which the neurotypical person who says, I can read the Bible because I understand context, it obviously doesn't mean this, it obviously means that, it's obviously the other, may well be in grave danger of reading all kinds of 21st century assumptions into the text that aren't there, whereas my rather more pedantic approach that sort of says I've got to go through and work out what the assumptions are and might end up with a better interpretation. Who knows? Sometimes, every now and again.
I absolutely agree. No, I think that's great. Do we have another question?
Yeah, we'll knock out one of the theological ones. To what extent is the conception of autism spectrum condition as a problem to the relationality of the Imago Dei due to Trinitarian theology and the I-thou command response stances? This sounds right up your alley of your article.
Can you read it again?
Yes.
While you think about it, I'll just add a couple of thoughts. I think this is a brilliant question, and in Joanna's article, she critiques this sort of relational approach and says how theologians have started there, which is not where autistic people start anyway, and then they've proceeded down the track and then sort of says, oh, look, it doesn't work for autistic people. Of course it doesn't. You kind of knock them out before you started. And so this is all part of the same game. All right, so you got Imago Dei, then the Trinity, which is a construction that we have put together to try and grapple with what we cannot explain. So it's a construction, it's a metaphor, if you like, but it's based on the idea of relationality, which doesn't necessarily it's not that autistic people don't like other people or something like that, but their brains work systemically, not relationally. Does that make sense? So we'll put the pieces together and say that's not logical, it doesn't fit, as opposed to kind of how does that work relationally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you want me to read it once more for you?
Yeah, well, I do actually just want Patrick as well, if
Yeah.
you could still read it again, just to make sure I heard it properly.
To what extent is the conception of autistic spectrum condition as a problem to the relationality of the Imago Dei due to Trinitarian theology and the I, thou / command response stances?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And if the person hasn't read the full article that I wrote on that, they might find that very interesting and helpful. So it's in the,
I agree with that.
but I would want to differentiate between the Trinity and the I-thou relation in this question, right? Because I think the I-thou relationship, the phrase I-thou relationships is from a movement at the end of the 19th century called Dialogical Personalism, if you want the fancy name for the philosophical movement. And I think that had very clear links to then the development of I think it influenced the original autistic diagnosis by a chap called Leo Kanner in Austria. And I think he was very influenced by this philosophical movement. And so I think that and then autism then moves back and impacts later philosophical and theological movements as well. So this is all to say, in the 20th century, I think that construction, that philosophy that's behind that phrase, and the development of a particular conception of autism that is now quite out of date, are very intertwined together. So I think the idea that autism is perceived as a problem for particular types of relationships is deeply intertwined with this philosophical movement, which has been very influential. It's also a theological movement. I think they are very intertwined, and what I try and do in that article is unpick that relationship to see how it started, how they became intertwined, so that we can see that it doesn't actually have to be that way, right? This is why we do history, to learn that things didn't have to turn out that way. They just, here's how they did, but they didn't have to. It wasn't inevitable. When it comes to the Trinity, I think we have to change tack slightly, primarily because the doctrine of the Trinity is much older and doesn't have that same historical set of interweaving connections. That said, the doctrine of the Trinity is highly confusing, let's be honest. And there are different, what's called models of the Trinity. So same doctrine, same three persons, one God, but different ways of understanding that. And it's only, I would suggest, it's only quite recently, perhaps linked to the same history, that we get what's called the social model. The social model of the Trinity being that God's three individual people, a bit like humans, but better, in relationship with one another. That's not really even that isn't really the social Trinity, the social model of the Trinity. Even that's quite simplistic and quite reduced. There are other ways of understanding the Trinity that aren't God is three individual human-like persons in relationship to one another. And I actually think that God is beyond our ken, beyond our understanding, and there's a little bit of truth in that God is three persons in relationship, insofar as God is love. That might have a grain of truth in it. But I don't think we should understand the Trinity only like that. And if we do understand the Trinity only like that, that's when problems start to creep in lots of areas. Autism and the valuing of autistic people being one area, problems start to creep in. Because there are, say St. Augustine described the Trinity as more like three parts of the human mind, right? Memory, I can't remember what they are now, but three cognitive capacities. They're not persons, but it's still personal because they're cognitive capacities that are personally engaging, as it were. This is all to say there are lots of metaphors for the Trinity. Not all of them are like three human beings. And I'm going to start repeating myself if I keep talking now, so ask me a different question.
Can I just add a sentence to that? Because I've just endorsed what Joanna said about her article, really, really helpful, particularly the way that those two threads of thinking about autism and the whole, what do you call it, dialectical relationalism?
Dialogical, because it's about dialogue.
Oh, no, not
Dialogical personalism.
Yeah, dialogical personalism. Okay, so the way in which they got sort of entwined. I think I would just kind of throw a thought in there, that all of this is coming out of the same, what the Germans would call a Weltanschauung. The nearest we would have is a sort of world view. That's the way we kind of try to kind of describe God in the context of the Trinity, and I absolutely agree with what Joanna says about that. I think the whole thing about relationality being a core thing, we would say that, wouldn't we? I had read one book where this guy quoted an ancient Greek, I don't know who it was, if horses had gods, they'd look like horses. But also then the thinking about autism, which also interprets autism through the lens of relationality. And, you know, hence what you've got now is the whole sort of movement of people who've grown up and who are articulate and autistic saying, hey, don't you define us, you know, nothing about us without us, and all of these sort of things, where you've got a sort of culture clash going on at the moment, where the medical fraternity has held sway with its definitions, and that those are just imported into that discussion that you describe without criticism, really, aren't they? Just accepted as being, and then the autism word is used almost casually to describe people who lack spirituality or who are in the darkest place beyond grace and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, this will pick up on a couple of threads there. I think what's really interesting about the way when we see this interwoven relationship with how autism becomes a diagnosis and the sorts of things that get focused on and the criteria that get put up in psychology and the theological influences in that, is that now, as you say, that the diagnosis and the understanding of autism is ever changing, and what's good about how it's currently changing is autistic people themselves are starting to have a voice in it, which is fantastic. And what is happening because of that is that there's been, I think, a slight decentering of the relational aspect. So now it's not just about social cognition and social performance, which was the key, the thing, right? The core element. It's now also got all these other aspects. So sensory aspects are becoming much more important. Language and context and attention and all sorts of other bits, as it were. Not to say that the relational aspect isn't there, but it's not as not the be-all and end-all that it used to be.
Right.
And I think that's an important kind of next step from what you say too. But also what you just highlighted at the end there, is really what kicked off this whole thing for me. Apart from that, I told you about the undergraduate class where I just thought no one said anything about this. That, you know, what really drove me back to focus on it now is the discovery that some theologians do talk about autism, and they do so terribly. You'll find that almost all good, or not all good, all interesting theological debates start off with someone doing something wrong and other people wanting to correct it.
Is that right?
Heresies are really important for theology in that regard, right?
Was it C.S. Lewis who said we need good philosophy for no other reason than to answer bad philosophy?
Yeah, exactly. I saw a wonderful, this is a bit trivial, I saw a wonderful cartoon recently of an academic, it was in a cartoon, standing up and saying, "Thank you for this award for my long academic career. I really owe it to all the people I've had lifelong embittered fights with. I wouldn't be here without you, you know." Exactly. So I found something to push against in a 6 theologians who I found using autism in ways that I found highly problematic, and I wanted to unpick why are they turning to autism to describe sin or unbelief? Why is that their go-to language and metaphor? Seems really potentially offensive and problematic, but also just really bizarre. Why?
Random.
Yeah. So I wanted to understand what was going on there, and that's really what set me on this journey of.
Yeah, I mean, since I began organizing this event, doing more reading, listening to you guys with their podcasts, videos, reading the books, one of the things I've been reflecting on as a minister myself, teaching the Bible, is just to reflect upon what's implicit in my theology, right? There's kind of the water we swim in that feels so natural, and we have our own benchmarks of what does it mean to be in I find relationship very important, right? So what does it mean to be in a good relationship with God? And you begin to use metaphors and to speak from this. So this has really been challenging to me to reflect upon, okay, what does this mean for different people within the body of Christ? And how do I be entering conversation so I can develop new metaphors and reimagine what does it look like to be a quote unquote good Christian, a good, human. And so thank you both for helping me on this journey in my thinking and conversation. If we could step away from the explicitly, I guess, theological, though I guess it's all theology in a way, you might argue. Thinking through kind of whether we call it the church services or the church community, whether it's relating to the cognitive or sensory things, what would be maybe 1, 2, 3 tips you would give to, let's say, a minister or people in leadership in a church community to begin a process of whether it's being more inclusive to autistic members, drawing awareness to, helping them participate more in the life of the church? What would you say to a minister asking you sitting down for coffee?
Okay, read my book, look at my website, have a look at my training material. Well, I've already said it in a way. So talk to the autistic people in your church. Might have to find out who they are.
May I say that I was surprised at how many people in my life I did not know were autistic until I started organizing this event.
Right.
I was
So
like,
there
oh,
will
wow.
be some who you know about who are autistic, but if you just met me in the street, you wouldn't put me in that category necessarily, okay? Because now autism, autism is basically an information processing issue. And so, if you imagine being told, go and get some crisps, there's a supermarket, walk into the supermarket to get crisps, okay? And when you get there, there's an aisle the length of this church full of crisps. How do you feel? Well, you initially feel quite anxious, possibly, because there's just too much information. What am I supposed to do there? So then the second thing you probably try to do is you set up some rules to say, right, okay, am I just getting, big bags, small bags? My rule would be I just buy the same as I bought last time, so that's very simple. But that sense that there is an almost infinite explosion of possibilities in the data, not just kind of words, but light, sounds that your brain is processing. And if you have a processor, I'm being very crude here, like, on your computer, that processes things that fit into this system, and anything else either just wrecks the system, or it's noise, or nothing happens, okay? So you can quite easily see how too much sensory stuff that the processor can't handle, boom, 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 meltdown at some point if we can't get out of it. So I think you've got to learn some basics. Now, I'm sure that, I could spend half an hour going through my understanding of what autism is, and I'd be criticised by academics on one side, medics on another, and so on and so forth. But somehow we have got to put in the hands of the people trying to do something practical, something other than, here are these diagnostic manuals that say all of these useless things, and we're all different, so don't take any notice of any of that. At which point you go, well, you haven't told me anything. I need something with some predictive capability that says, if we do that, that is probably going to cause a problem for a few people. Let's go and see. So I would say, get yourself to that kind of match of the day level of understanding what autism is, then you stand a chance.
Yeah, I definitely some basic understanding first. Step one, is in reading, watching things, whatever. Talking to your church and talking to the individuals in your church. If you're running a home group, talking to people in your home group, because everyone is a bit different. Even so, basic understanding, and then understanding how that basic understanding is differently manifested and has variation within it. But if you wanted the two most important things to do, and you can go from there, right? And I think it's important to keep the conversation going as well, right? It's not just a consultation and then whoever the leader is in whatever context then decides what to do about it. It's got to be an ongoing relationship. But one of the things, if I was to point to one thing that I would think would be helpful for a number of different types of people, not just for autism, is to really think carefully about how much we value synchronicity, how much we value people doing things together at the same time, at the same volume, in the same way. And making sure that we try and create a culture in church where if someone says the creed out of time, we don't all go, oh, they're so annoying, that was so off-putting, or singing out of key. I mean, this is not really just about autism. This is just about creating an environment where we're not judging one another based on how well we're performing certain church activities. Actually having children running around can be really helpful for just getting us out of that really protective space, and still creating a sense of holy space together. But I mean, again, this is not really just about, this is just about creating an inclusive environment, saying that you're welcome at the beginning. If you need to stand up and go and twirl, there's a space for you to do that. If you need to stim, go for it. No one's going to stare at you or think you're weird, you know. Now, at first, people might stare at you and think you're weird, but you can teach your congregation not to do that. I think there's a whole, that's my main worry, is about when we're just told to all sit still. That can be very difficult.
Yeah, go ahead, Stuart.
I think for those who are preaching, I think just a word of caution that there may well be people sitting in front of you who could take what you are saying very literally, and you don't need to do much about it. But I went to a service not too long ago, and the preacher got up and talked about the passage where Jesus saying, you know, if anybody among you wants to be great, let him be the least, and so on and so on and so forth.
You just lost your mic.
I've lost my mic.
Yes.
Goodness. Everything I've said for the last hour is completely lost.
I could hear you wonderfully. Yeah.
As could I.
Okay, so so give preachers one or two tips. Whoever amongst you wants to be the greatest should be the least, and so on and so forth. And I listened to this, and I came out of that, and I thought, do you know, there's plenty of people for whom that would be a devastating message. You know, I say, no, you know, and the clue is in the passage. Jesus says, if any among you will be the greatest. Except my mum would be a terrific candidate for somebody who takes that as a license to be a doormat. But you know, it doesn't apply to her, so don't go and do it. And a bit like me, you know, and I've got on my training course, you know, the Son of Man had nowhere to lay his head. Go and do thou likewise. You know, I've heard plenty of sermons like that. I've preached a few.
Yeah, you've mentioned your training course a couple times. Would you like to give a quick plug for that?
Yeah, okay, so it's if you look for Church for Everyone, stick that in the web, you will find there's an autism section there, and in there there's a whole kind of website which includes a set of 8 training modules. They're very amateur. They're me doing a video, 8 videos. So some of them are practical. How do I find out who in my church might be autistic? How do I put together a sort of communication plan? So on and so forth. So it's kind of half a dozen modules, what to do to put together something for the church. A couple of modules, what if you want to go deeper, get a deeper understanding of autism, or how do I create a theology in my church in which autism is accommodated? Because you wouldn't believe how many unwritten assumptions you've got about how your church works and how your theology works. And one overview. So there you go. So those are just videos, and then you can have a follow-up discussion or whatever.
If I could flip the question, we've spent a lot of time talking about how does the church respond to autism as though autistic individuals are outside the church, as though there's some sort of object. Let's flip it around. Someone who is autistic within the church, what advice would you give to them as the church? to engage in a place in which they may feel like the minority, or they may feel like the outsider, where everything is catered to someone unlike themselves?
That's me. I suppose.
Whoever would like to pick it up.
It's
probably best for you to pick it up first, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I would add anything to the things that Joanna and I have said already. I think listen. One of the things I referred to this project with the Post Office and the Royal Mail. I worked there for the guy who was running the overall programme, and he was a guy I've known for many years, and he called me in basically, and he did throughout his whole career to sort out the problems. So I used to go around sweeping up for him. But I used to say to him, Roger, I can get by on a day-by-day basis with 15 seconds in the corridor, just hello, whatever. Every now and again, I need to sit down and we need to go out for a meal for an evening and talk. Once a month, whatever it is. And my wife once told me that it took 2 hours of talking to me before I said anything sensible that she could understand. Now, I've been married 38 years and we've got it down to an hour and a half, I believe. But I think, yeah, find time occasionally to listen to me. Doesn't have to be very often, but it will go on for some time, okay, till I get to what it is I was really trying to say. And I think that's not uncommon. I think the sort of, so I go to NAS board meetings, there's 25 people in there. Unless you can pitch in with something pithy in 10 seconds, you've missed your chance. Almost impossible. And at the moment, I'm challenging them to say, how are you working this out for autistic trustees? But that's another discussion.
And NAS would be the National Autistic Society, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think listen and understand that every now and again I need a good conversation and I need to get to the bottom of what it is I'm trying to say. Every now and again. Could be once every 6 months.
Is there anything you'd like to add from your experiences?
The question was, how can the church...
As an autistic person, how would you advise the church?
Yeah, great. So as a non-autistic person, but the question was two autistic people.
Well, I guess, yeah. The way I originally said it, and perhaps I wasn't clear, would be, what advice would you give to an autistic member of a church, whether it's to press on or to, if you're trying to disciple another member of the church that's autistic, does that look different? Or we talked earlier about the danger of infantilizing this issue, right? We don't want to treat an autistic member as some sort of infant that needs to be handled with kid gloves. But yeah, I mean, is there kind of what advice would you give to perhaps a younger or older autistic member if you're in a discipleship relation with them, or to encourage them in a positive way to participate in the church or flourish in their Christian life?
The first thing I would want to say is, even though the church has probably failed you and society has probably failed you, that the church is still for you and God is still for you. And to apologize for any time that has not been evident. And to ask them to bear with me, us, and to teach me, us.
Let's work together on it.
And to work together, exactly, yeah, exactly. And just to really, I really want to emphasize the gift aspect. That for autistic Christians with learning disabilities as well, of which I know a number, to be given roles in the church, roles as greeting people on the door, or as making coffee, or as handing out leaflets, or whatever they are capable of doing, is such a gift that can totally transform a community. And so I would encourage them to find where they can serve actively, because it will be of such benefit to the community. And that just because they've got a diagnosis, or there are certain things they don't do instinctively that other people do, so I really appreciate flipping the question, so it's not just always about how does the church accommodate, how does the church embrace, but really, how does the church serve under the leadership of autism sometimes. So, yeah.
Can I just add one thought? I don't know whether it will come up in any of the questions, but all of the things we've said tonight, we haven't made any reference to the fact that some autistic people are non-verbal. And obviously there's a whole sort of separate category of thought that's required in that space.
Thank you. We have a couple comments here. I'll just read them. Thank you for them. Pete Phillips wrote something in Premiere about people with autism, positive engagement with online church in the pandemic. This seems to offer questions, possibilities. So that's just very interesting. I guess during the pandemic we've been forced to do church differently. It's caused us to rethink a lot of things differently. And I know at my church we've had conversations about, you know, continuing many of these new practices that perhaps when we first adopted we thought they were just out of necessity and temporary, but certain people have really flourished under different forms. I think there's even this benefit of kind of in our evening services, being able to come in on Zoom, it helps navigate certain sensory issues, right? So they can be present, virtually present with the church community without necessarily being in the room. So it can be very easy to retreat from that thing. But so the next one, and then I'll let you comment on either if you would like. Reflection: as an autistic person, I do enjoy being in relationships with others, but very picky about socializing and communicating. So I think that's just a insightful comment.
I get that. It makes sense. You know, it's not the case that autistic people don't like other people, but socializing. So here's my experience of socializing. You're standing in a group of people, they start talking about something, could be their holidays. What I would tend to do, because I think very deeply, that disappears off in here somewhere, and I'm thinking, oh yes, holidays, and I come back up with a comment, oh no, they're talking about football. Okay, and I go back in there, and 10 minutes later I come out with some profundity about football, if there is such a thing. And oh, they're talking about politics. So it's the information processing thing again. If you just imagine the complexity, who was it? What's his name? Whoever was the guy that came up with the thing that in a communication, a conversation, 7% of that communication is the words that are used. Morabian, that's the name of it. So 93% is other stuff, okay? Facial expressions, the, kind of tone of voice, all this. So things that the word I use in my book is things that are not there. And the autistic brain works with things that are there, a bit like the computer. You put stuff in there, it doesn't invent data in the computer. So imagine then the processing that is going on when you've got a group of 6 people, possibly all talking at once, coming at you, and you're trying to work out how to respond. That is a huge processing issue for a brain that works on a systemic basis rather than a relational basis. But that's not to say we don't like people.
Thank you. I do want to open the floor up to here. I know I've been a little bit long with this discussion, but are there any live questions would like to pose? I mean, I have a million more questions, and I just had a couple-hour dinner with them. But yeah, was there a hand? Did I miss one?
It's not a question, but a comment. I hate microphones so much. Oh, has it gone off again?
No, it's on.
No,
it's on.
So we were having this whole discussion earlier, but one of the biggest things I think that I also want to say as an autistic person is it doesn't matter if you don't like church. Like if you listen to this whole thing and go, still don't like it, still stresses me out, still is a sensory nightmare, that your productivity, your contribution to a community does not determine how God feels about you. Like God loves you and he likes you regardless of whether you want to be part of church or not. So I think there's something to be said for how much we still tie contribution and productivity to this sense of worth, even if that is a contribution that doesn't conform to like neurotypical ideas of what that looks like. If you don't want to contribute at all, God still likes you and God still loves you. That's nothing, you can't do anything about that, sorry.
How would you connect that to like a theology of gifts, the body of Christ, and that sort of participatory side of Christian theology? there's certainly many commands in Scripture to go and do, but completely agreeing with the being, and it doesn't change our view of, or how God views us. But how do you kind of weigh that? Is it just an individual basis?
Yeah, I find myself pulled in more than one direction in that. So first of all, absolutely agree that God's love is unconditional. I also think that the church is meant to be a gift to all people. Obviously, the tragedy is that it's not. But I think when God is not going to, God, for some reason, far beyond my understanding, is not giving up on the church, even when the church acts appallingly. And so, in that sense, I feel that we can't entirely give up on church either, but must endeavor to make it a blessing for all people. That said, there will be moments, as I said earlier, in people's lives that looks different, where we can serve the church differently. It doesn't always mean being there at 10 a.m. on a Sunday. But I also, that can't be an excuse for just not bothering to get out of bed. There has to be some discernment in there. That is filled with grace.
Bedside Baptist.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's like Pillowside Presbyterian and some others as well. Yes,
just a sentence
Stuart?
on that. I agree with all of that, Joanna. I also think that we use the word church to mean a lot of things, and it's a many-layered thing. Often what we're talking about is an organisation, as opposed to the body of Christ. And so I think a lot depends on what we mean when we say church. And it's perfectly possible to be in the body of Christ without attending any meetings.
Would you place any responsibility on an autistic individual to seek or to make aware their thing to church leadership, or do you think, would you place the responsibility on the church leadership to kind of discern and define these sort of, because my assumption would be you would want some kind of connectedness, right? Even if someone is not attending the gatherings, there's still some kind of, the ecclesia, the gathered, so there's some kind of unity, body.
Why?
Yeah, well, that's a good question.
But in one sense,
there's a call to community, right? There's a call to community as whatever the church is.
But you somewhat answered your own question. You said, I would think you would want this. Well, why not ask me what I want?
Who? I'm sorry, I didn't know.
Your sentence was, I would think you would want.
So the you wasn't you in particular. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
By you, I was talking about more of an abstract,
anyone, right?
Theological reflection on the church, of what is the church, and so I guess I probably should have been more specific. Of
no, you were fine.
Yeah.
What I was challenging was the words that you used. I would think.
Yes.
In other words, I'm making an assumption that this is what people should do or want or whatever. And I'm saying, whoa, before you do that, go back and just, let's start before that assumption and find out what people want, rather than kind of, I would think this is what people want.
Yeah.
Because, there are many passages that you can look to in the Bible, which suggest, don't give up meeting together, as is the habit of some, and all this sort of stuff.
Yes.
That you can justify a lot of things by reading the scriptures. Slavery, all kinds of things. And we tend to do that in what we think church is. So that's all. And I think this is quite challenging for everybody, because you suddenly realise you've been assuming a lot of things.
Indeed.
So if what you're saying is it possible that someone, by, as it were, going it alone, can suffer some sort of social deficit, that's a good question, but it's not necessarily a damn slunk answer that they are.
I think I think we're not Christians alone, ever. So that's not saying that you have to have a PAL group all the time. I think there are examples of people, say missionaries, who have gone to other parts of the world and been the only Christian that they know. That's not what I mean exactly. And again, I mean, I think this brings us back to the issue of perhaps we confuse a particular form of sociality, relationality with a kind of more richer concept of love and community. And so I just don't think that you're never a Christian alone. But I agree with you, that doesn't mean you have to join a certain club and come to certain meetings. But I think that's worth bearing in mind. So I'm talking about the invisible church when I say that,
Yes.
the communion of saints. I'm also talking about the visible church. But I just think that's important to remember, even when we're talking about there might be different stages and different ways of discipleship and ways of being with the body of Christ. The ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church and the church matters because there are no Christians alone. There never were and there never will be, right? And I don't think our faith makes sense if we think of it in purely individualistic terms.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts. Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole nother hour, I think, on ecclesiology, and I mean, there's a lot of questions related to. I mean, do you need to belong to a visible church community? Do you need to be part of some form of submitting to some kind of church authority within the structure? And so those are kind of a lot of really interesting questions. But do we have any more questions we would like to pose quickly before we move to wine? Wow, that makes you seem like you're bad if you raise your hand. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for saying it that way. Let's go Preston, then James.
Thus far, we have been talking about church and church gatherings as more or less of a kind of social events. Could we conceive church gatherings in very different terms, such as participation in the divine presence, and thus how we process that within ourselves and how good we are at socializing would matter very little. So couldn't that be a viable route to unproblematize autism?
Do you see this conception as having to be physically present to experience that presence?
Yes, that is the movement of the divine spirit that matters, and
Indeed.
we contribute very little, if anything.
Yeah. Thoughts either?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that we don't only go to church for the socializing. Frankly, that much as I am a very extroverted social being, like there are other ways I would get my social kicks. Honestly, it's not the reason we go to. I mean, I enjoy it personally, but there's not, yeah, and that was part of the reasons for wanting to emphasize that the church does matter, imperfect as it is because sacraments matter, worship matters, but that doesn't mean everyone has to do it the same way every single week, right? I think getting baptized matters, but I don't think if you don't, that's it, you're out, But I do think getting baptized matters. So we need to be able to hold those things together. And certainly I appreciate very much you adding to this conversation that church isn't just a social event. We're doing other stuff. We're worshiping, we're being in the presence of God, but we are doing so together. So there is also an irreducible social element to it, even then. But yeah.
I think not much to add to that. I think yes, the variety of things. If I've understood the question right, interestingly, in my research participants, I found some who liked the more sacramental type of worship, and others who said, no, that doesn't mean anything to me at all, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think all of these things are part of a rich picture. And I think you were looking quite excited about this point. Did you want to add it?
Really to add, except for like.
Oh,
I don't think they can hear.
you
So.
can walk up here if you want to say something. Or you can,
No,
or you
you-
can hand that mic.
We knew it was going to happen.
Otherwise, the live stream won't be able to hear you.
Well, I just think it's interesting, the notion that, like, I suppose I sit on two, as an autistic person who works in church, like, I lead worship, I preach, I do church stuff, but also find it quite sensibly quite a difficult environment. I do believe that we're never Christians alone because God's there. So I suppose I don't ever wonder about doing my faith with other people as being the only space where I can do my faith. And I'm not presuming that that's what you meant, but sort of just the beingness with God. I don't think about other people in that space. And so, like Preston said, like, you don't have to worry about whether you can socialize or not when you're hanging out with God. Like, but then even that is a conceptual thing that for some autistic people is like, what do you mean hanging out with God? What does that even mean? So I recognize that, like, there is sort of what we call in my church Christianese language, where you're sort of saying things that, like, the lay person might not even understand, and as an autistic person, anyway, whatever. But that beingness with God doesn't require other people. So yeah, I was just agreeing with Preston.
I do wonder. I do wonder about that. I mean, if we read 1 John, we talk about if you hate your brother, you cannot love God, right? And so I am just curious if we could, if it's worth commenting on that point of to what sense can you? I mean, I'm interested in this stuff because the philosopher I focus on is very much about the individual to God, right? And he's often accused of not incorporating the social aspect in there. So yeah, to what extent can we properly know God apart from community with others?
We can love people and not want to be around them all the time.
No, I agree with that point, yes.
We
Yes,
can
we're on
love
the same
people.
page for that,
We
yes.
can be like, I believe that you
Yes.
are made in the image of God, and
Yeah.
I love you quite a lot. I don't want to spend all my time
Yeah.
with you, and I might not want to spend my worship time with you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, you guys want to pick up anything on that point?
Well, I think, you know, if you look at the example of Jesus, you've got all kinds of patterns in there. You know, times when he spent in the wilderness on his own, times when he was, you know, he went in and out amongst the people. So I don't think you can legislate on those. Not very profound.
No, that was very profound. I think you're absolutely right.
Okay.
I don't think we get to think, oh, I don't like worshiping with you, as it were. Like, we have to include those around us. But that doesn't mean we can't sometimes retreat for our own private time with God too. And I think following the pattern of Jesus on that is exactly the right way to explain it.
Cool. James, would you like to come in with perhaps a final question of the evening?
Sure. Thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot. My question is sort of a little bit of a different direction. A lot of the discussion...
Just talk up. Just talk louder.
I always make sure, well, I try and make sure, and I hope others will help me, never answer a question with what it's like to be an autistic person, because I don't know. So I would ask Stuart to comment on that aspect of it. The only other thing I wanted to add is that I don't know of any aspect that I've read about or heard about from autistic friends that would particularly press on those questions. There might be that I just don't know of. But I would say we always have to think of the wealth and diversity of human experience, and I worry about other things when it comes to that side of spirituality. So I worry about OCD, and I worry about eating disorders and fasting. So OCD and encouraging over scrupulosity in a way that becomes detrimental to the person's well-being. So I think we need to think about the variety of human beings and think about each one in turn, case-by-case basis. So, but I don't know of anything particular for autism and those spiritual discipline sides of Christian spirituality.
Okay. I think all I would add to that, I think there are some aspects of some of those disciplines that some autistic people, this is a very qualified answer, find helpful because they contain a rhythm and a regularity, and I think some of the sort of habitual practices I think people find calming and helpful and meaningful. I wouldn't say it's necessarily universal, but I do think there is something there that attracts the sort of autistic soul a bit. But you know, I think Joanna's right to call out some of the challenges, and one of the dangers that autistic people might bring into this space is being obsessive about that, as they are about everything, or lots of things, and that can become a danger if what they're not eating or eating and so on is becoming problematic. But as a general thought, the structure and discipline can be calming and can be helpful.
Cool, well, thank you so much. We're going to take some time for wine. Thank you to all those who tuned in on the live stream. I think I'm looking up this way toward the camera.
Any wine for them?
Unfortunately, we do not deliver, but if you have Uber Eats in your area and you're in the UK and it's not 10 yet, so you still have time. Thank you for coming. Once again, if you want to learn more about Trinity Forum Edinburgh, I actually don't know if it's .com or .org. Try both, I guess. And we do have an upcoming event again, the 10th of March. On Why Beauty Matters with artist Alistair Gordon. I'm incredibly excited about that, so do reach out if you're interested in that. Thank you again, Dr. Joanna Leidenhag, I believe I pronounced that one right, as well as Stewart Rapley. Thank you so much. I will send out an email to all who had RSVP'd to this event with just some helpful links, perhaps to Stewart's resources as well, Joanna's article, all that. So thank you once again for coming. Appreciate it.